Hospitals have always been places where life and death share the same corridors. Every nurse understands that. But there are some stories that never find their way into patient records. This is one of them. This story is said to have taken place in Thailand during the early 1960s. Back then, nursing was a demanding profession. Hospitals were understaffed, equipment was limited, and night duty was something many nurses quietly tried to avoid. Not because the work was difficult, but because people believed certain hospitals became different after midnight. Long corridors seemed longer. The silence carried differently. Patients occasionally spoke to people who weren't there. Although there was a chatter about these strange happenings among the nurses. One nurse never paid them any attention at all. Her name was Mali. She had worked at the hospital for almost 15 years. For those who trained beside her, they would all describe the same woman: calm under pressure, steady hands, never afraid to make difficult decisions. She volunteered for the night shifts when others avoided them. She stayed behind after her shift ended if another ward needed help. When families panicked, she was usually the one who spoke to them first. Mali, though in her 30s, was single and lived alone. She left her village to move to the city in search of a better life. She wanted to help people and thus decided to become a nurse. The younger nurses admired her. The senior doctors trusted her. Patients remembered her long after they forgot the names of the physicians who treated them. There was another reason many women sought her out. One almost nobody spoke about. In those years, women facing unwanted pregnancies often had very few safe options. Some disappeared for days and returned gravely ill after visiting untrained midwives. There are others who never came back at all. A small number of nurses quietly tried to help those women before desperation led them somewhere far more dangerous. Mali was one of them. She never advertised it. She never accepted money beyond what the women could afford. And no one in the hospital knew this except for a handful of nurses. And only those working the night shift were willing to help her with whatever she was doing. But not everyone approved. An older nurse named Prani often warned her. "One day," she said quietly while folding bandages late one evening, "something bad will happen and they won't care why you were trying to help." Mali never argued with her. She simply answered, "If I send them away, they'll go somewhere worse." Prani had no reply. She didn't agree with Mali, but she understood the plight of the women who came looking for her. One rainy evening, a young woman arrived after visiting hours. She was alone. Her clothes were damp from the storm. She looked terrified. One of the younger nurses quietly brought her through the service entrance before anyone in administration noticed. The procedure began without incident, and all of a sudden, something changed. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Mali worked for almost an hour trying to save her. Every decision she made came from experience. Every instruction she gave was calm. The younger nurse assisting her later said Mali never once raised her voice. But some patients cannot be brought back. Before sunrise, the young woman was gone. Mali buried herself in work after that. No one spoke about what had happened. Neither she nor the nurses who had assisted her ever discussed that night again. Prani watched her closely over the weeks that followed. She noticed the tired eyes, the longer silences, The way Mali sometimes paused before washing her hands, staring into the running water, as though still remembering something she wished she could forget. Still, she continued working. She never refused another patient. She never abandoned the night shift. If anything, she worked harder than before. The first strange thing happened nearly 4 months later. A patient recovering from surgery pressed the call bell shortly after 2 in the morning. When Mali entered the room, the woman asked, "Who was the nurse standing behind you?" Mali turned. The doorway was empty. The patient seemed embarrassed. "Oh, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought someone came in with you." Mali smiled politely and carried on. She told herself hospitals often confuse people who were recovering from anesthesia. But then it happened again. An elderly man thanked two nurses for helping him sit up in bed. Only Mali had entered the room. Weeks later, a little girl waved at someone behind her. "There she is again," the girl said happily. "The lady with wet hair." Mali stopped asking questions after that. The old lift became part of the rumors almost by accident. Sometimes, while she worked alone after midnight, it would arrive at her floor, even though nobody called it. Its doors would open, wait, then quietly close again. She never found that particularly frightening. Hospitals were old buildings. Machines failed. It was easier to believe that than anything else. What did unsettle her was more the feeling that someone was patiently waiting for her to step inside. Nearly a year after the young woman's death, Mali was finishing her rounds. She checked every ward, spoke to the last patient still awake, collected her notes, then she walked toward the lift. An orderly saw her enter. He smiled. She smiled back. Then the doors closed. When the lift failed to arrive downstairs, maintenance forced the doors open. Mali was still inside. She had collapsed against the wall. Dark bruises circled her neck. The doctors searched for an explanation. There wasn't one they could all agree upon. The police found no evidence that anyone else had entered the lift. The hospital held a memorial a few days later. The wards were unusually quiet. Even the patients who had only known Mali for a few days asked why their favorite nurse hadn't returned. Prani attended the service but spoke very little. As people began leaving, one of the younger nurses found her standing alone in the corner. "Do you still think she was wrong?" she asked. Prani looked toward the empty lift. Then she answered softly, "I think she spent her whole life carrying other people's burdens." She paused. "I only wish she hadn't carried them alone." The hospital continued operating. New nurses arrived. Old ones retired. The story was passed quietly from one generation to the next, usually during someone's first night shift. Not to frighten them, but to remember a nurse who chose compassion over convenience, even when it carried consequences she could never have imagined. Some still say the hospital was haunted. Others insist the building was simply old. And as for Mali, she was never defined by her death to those who knew her. Instead, she was remembered for her courage, strength, and deep empathy. They remembered her because when vulnerable women had nowhere left to go, she opened the door. In the old rubber estates of Malaysia, work began before the world had fully opened its eyes. Men and women entered the plantation in darkness, their oil lamps swaying low at their sides, their tapping knives ready in hand. The rows of trees stood in long, disciplined lines, each trunk scarred by the small cuts that would make the latex flow. From a distance, the estate looked orderly, even peaceful. But anyone who worked there enough knew that before sunrise, sound behaved strangely. Shadows sat too long in places they shouldn't, and the stillness had a way of feeling occupied rather than empty. The old workers had stories for that feeling. They said the forest had not disappeared when the plantation was built. It had only been pushed back, and in the places where the jungle had once grown thick and wild, things had remained. One of them was a Pontianak. Most workers would rather not describe her in detail unless they had to. It was enough to say she was the spirit of a woman who had died in terrible circumstances, often spoken as someone lost in childbirth, betrayed, abandoned, or left alone in pain. In the estates, her name was spoken carefully, usually by older men who had already learned not to dismiss what could not be explained. They said she could sound close when she was far away. They said she could sound far away when she was already near. A baby crying in the dark. A woman laughing softly beneath the trees. Warnings told to instill fear in you as soon as you start questioning reality. It was also said that if the smell of frangipani drifted through the plantation where no flowers had been planted, it was best to turn back and not ask why it was there. Iskandar had worked the western rows for years, and by then he thought he knew the estate as well as anyone could. He was steady, practical, and proud of the fact that he had never been one to invent fears just because other men did. He came early, worked quickly, and minded his own path. His wife often told him the plantation had made him too silent. He only said that silence was useful when the world demanded too much of a man. For a long time, the estate gave him nothing worse than fatigue. Then one week, during the rainy season, it started. At first, it was only a tapping sound ahead of him while he worked. The sound didn't come from behind him or beside him, only ahead. The same light rhythm he used himself when cutting into the bark and setting the cups. He assumed one of the others had drifted into his section and started early. He called out once, expecting a joke or an answer across the trees, but none came. The sound continued moving in and out between the trunks, as if whoever made it stayed just beyond the line of trees. By the time Iskandar reached the place, the space between the trunks was empty, though the ground still held the look of recent movement, as if someone had passed through only moments before. He told himself he had simply missed them. The plantation was like that before dawn. It could swallow a man whole and still leave him thinking he had only been a few steps away the entire time. The next morning, it happened again. This time, he heard a bucket being dragged over damp earth. Not carried, dragged. The sound was strange enough to make him stop and listen longer than he should have. When he finally reached the source, the row of trees stood still and ordinary, the latex cups hanging neatly from the bark. Nothing there suggested anyone had ever been just ahead of him. Still, the sound had been clear. On the third morning, the laugh came. It wasn't loud. If anything, it was gentler than any laugh had a right to be, out there, alone, before sunrise. It seemed to rise from somewhere inside the plantation rather than from any single place within it, soft and delicate, gone almost before it touched the air. Iskander felt the same old unease his grandfather used to describe on nights that were too quiet. Then came the smell, frangipani, sweet at first, then so sweet it turned. The scent drifted through the trees and hung there, refusing to leave even after he turned his head. There were no flowering trees in his section, and he knew that, because he worked it long enough to know every root, every dip in the earth, every place water gathered after rain. He stopped moving. The lamp in his hand threw an unsteady light. Between two trunks, something pale shifted, only for a second. Gone before he could be certain his eyes hadn't invented it. A pale shape, the suggestion of cloth or a dress. Something gone before his mind could settle on a shape at all. He stood there far longer than he wanted to admit, waiting for it to return. It did not. Instead, the tapping began again. Not far enough, not near enough to see, just ahead. Iskander told himself he would not follow it. He had a route to finish before the others arrived. But the sounds had already done what such sounds are meant to do. They had loosened the ground beneath his certainty. Without quite deciding to, he found he'd already started walking towards them. That was how the plantation took hold of him. Not all at once, but by inches. He followed the tapping through the western rows, then deeper than he usually went, then beyond the section he had worked for years. The estate changed around him as he moved. The trees seemed older there, the soil darker, the paths less certain. The boundary ditch he expected to reach never came into view. The sounds stayed just ahead of him. The tap of the knife, the scrape of the bucket, and once again the small crying in the distance. So faint it felt less like a sound than a memory of one. When the laugh came again, it seemed to come from behind him. He turned quickly, and for the first time he saw a shape that did not belong there. Not clearly, not enough to name, only a suggestion of something pale and upright between the trunks, gone the instant his lamp swung toward it. His mouth went dry. For a moment, his legs wouldn't decide which way to move. The forest was supposed to be gone. The plantation had replaced it. That was the shape of the world now. But the pale shape had not felt like a person standing in the dark. It had felt like something that had been waiting a long time to be noticed. Iskander looked back the way he had come, meaning to return to the familiar rows, and found the path no longer looked familiar at all. He knew he hadn't walked far enough to be lost, and yet he couldn't say with any confidence where the turning point had been. The tapping sound had started again, from somewhere to his left. He moved that way before thinking. Then he stopped. Then he heard the baby crying. This time it was closer, so close it seemed to come from the shadows just beyond his lamp's reach. He remembered with certain clarity what the older men always said when the crying sounds were near. The Pontianak was somewhere else entirely. He didn't wait to find out where. He turned and walked faster until walking became a kind of stumbling hurry, and the plantation stopped feeling like a place and started feeling something built to hold him. The trees gave him nothing to read, no shift in the wind, no sound he could put a direction to. The rows stretched on in a way they had no right to. The dark pressed in closer with every breath he took. Then, as suddenly as it started, the sound around him changed. The tapping faded. The crying stopped. Even the insects went quiet. For a moment, there was only his own breathing and the low rustle of leaves overhead. Then a voice came softly from behind him. He stopped so abruptly, his lamp swung out of line. He did not turn. He already knew he was being called out by something that had no right to know his name that well. When he finally did glance back, there was nothing to see but narrow lanes of trees and the dark spaces between them. And yet he was certain, more certain than he'd ever been about anything else that morning. That something had stood there only a moment before, not close enough to touch, not far enough to forget. He ran, no longer caring whether he looked foolish or afraid. The plantation opened and closed around him in broken stretches of light. He lost a glove somewhere in the mud. His shirt caught on a branch and tore at the shoulder. Once he thought he heard footsteps matching his own pace exactly, but he didn't dare slow down long enough to check. By the time he reached the main track, the dark had thinned just enough to make out the shapes of other workers waiting there. They found him sitting where the estate road met the first row of trees, his lamp still burning in his hand. He wouldn't speak at first. When he finally did, he said only that he had gone too far into the west section, farther than he meant to go, and that he had heard another man walking ahead of him. The older workers exchanged looks, the kind that passes between people who have heard something like this before. One of them asked whether he had smelled anything sweet. Iskander nodded. The man said nothing for a moment. Then he asked whether he heard a child crying. Iskander's silence answered for him. Later that day, once the sun was high and the estate looked ordinary again, a few men went to inspect the section he had described. They came back quieter than they had left, the kind of quiet that settles over people who have found exactly what they were hoping they wouldn't. The place was real, old enough to show that it had belonged to the estate, but it had been abandoned for years. The trees there were overgrown, the drainage channels silted in, the small workers' huts sagged halfway into the earth. One of the latex cups they found had yellowed with age. Another had split clean through, as if it had sat out through many seasons of weather. No one said out loud what else they noticed, that the section felt used, but not by the living. The air still carried something unpleasantly sweet, that the men who went in came back speaking more quietly than they had going in. Iskander never took the western rows again. He became one of those workers who couldn't bear to look too long toward a dark line of trees before dawn. His wife noticed the change before anyone else did. The silence she'd once teased him about had turned into something else entirely. They say the Pontianak had never chased him at all. Chasing was for things that needed you to run. What she had done instead was quieter than that, and harder to undo. She had taught him to trust the sound of another life moving just ahead of his own. And once a man learns to follow a sound like that, the plantation stops being only a place of work. It becomes something that remembers exactly how to lead a man away from it. It is often repeated that one should not dream too much of the impossible, for fear that the unknown may answer. Rosie knew that better than most. She was a dance teacher living in Singapore, a Filipina woman who had come there alone and built a small life from what little she could carry. In the Philippines, she had once been admired for her beauty and grace. As a young woman, she had trained as a ballerina, and even after time had changed her, she still carried herself with the quiet poise of someone who had spent years learning how to move beautifully. Her husband, Roy Davis, had died when she was just 29. After that, Rosie opened a small dance school from home. At first, there were only two students, 11-year-old girls from the neighborhood. But the school grew little by little, enough to keep her busy, not enough to make her comfortable. And that was what troubled her. Rosie was God fearing. She went to church every Sunday, dressed carefully, smiled politely, and let her life appear orderly from the outside. But beneath the neat surface, she had dreams she had never said out loud. She wanted a richer life. She wanted a man who was successful, generous, and kind. She wanted to be loved in a way that would make all the waiting worthwhile. Men noticed her. Some offered her rides home after church. Some asked her out for coffee or breakfast or a little more for time than they should have. But Rosie was careful. She knew enough to trust slowly. Still, those small weekend encounters made her feel alive again. Then one Sunday, she noticed a handsome stranger watching her from the pews nearby, but she did not recognize him. When their eyes met, he smiled at her, and she found herself blushing before she could stop it. After the service, while she was speaking to a few women outside the church and laughing at a joke one of them made, she became aware of him again. He was watching her from his car across the road. He seemed amused by the sound of her laughter. Rosie rode her scooter home without thinking much of it. A few hours later, there was a knock at the front door. When she opened it, she found a box of chocolates and a small bunch of red roses left on the ground. She looked around, but the streets were empty. She carried the gifts inside. That evening, she went out with her friend Celine and Celine's husband Patrick to a nearby bar. It was happy hour. The place was lively and Rosie was beginning to relax when she noticed the same man from the church sitting at the bar. He raised his glass towards her. Then he stood, walked straight over, and introduced himself. Hi, I'm Noah. He held out his hand, and when she gave him hers, he kept it a moment too long. May I join you? Before anyone could answer, he had already pulled up a chair and sat down as if he belonged there. He told them he owned a hotel and several bars in the city. He looked the part. Expensive car, polished suit, easy confidence. The conversation warmed quickly around him. He spoke well. He smiled often. He made it easy to imagine that he was not only successful, but generous and intelligent too. Soon he was speaking directly to Rosie. I'd love to take dance classes too, he said. But I only teach women, she replied, smiling. I'll pay double. No. Triple? She laughed. He seemed to enjoy that. By the time the evening ended, he had already made his intentions clear, though in a way that felt playful rather than forceful. Before Rosie left, he asked if he could see her again. I'm really busy, she said, and got in the car. But he did see her again. The next day, flowers arrived. Then the next day, and again after that. Rosie called the florist using the number on the card and asked for the sender's address. As she guessed, it was Noah. She found the hotel where he stayed and drove there herself. At the front desk, they informed him that she was asking for him. He arrived smiling, and when he reached her, he hugged her as if they were already close. Rosie stiffened. I don't know you, she said, and I want you to stop with the gifts. I will, he said lightly, if you give me 4 dance classes. He was too confident, too amused, too sure of his effect on her. Have coffee with me, he added. You're already in my hotel. Against her better judgment, she agreed. Coffee turned into a longer conversation, then another, then more. They began meeting regularly at the bar and other places around the city. Noah was attentive in a way that made Rosie feel seen. He remembered details. He listened closely. He knew when to be charming and when to be quiet. He also knew how to make her feel cherished. Soon, he signed up for 2 weeks of dance classes at an amount that was far beyond what anyone else had ever paid her. It was 3 times what she earned in a whole month. Rosie told herself it was harmless. Then she told herself it was fortunate. Then, before she fully understood how far she had drifted, she realized she was in love. Noah showered her with expensive gifts. He made her feel like the woman she had been in her youth. And then something more than that. She forgot Roy Davis. Or perhaps she only forgot how much time had passed since she had last felt chosen. But there were things she did not understand. Every time Noah stayed over, he left while she was asleep. She never knew exactly when he went. Then one morning, while showering, she noticed a needle like mark on her neck. It was small, easy to ignore. Later, marks appeared in other places, behind her neck, lower on her spine, behind her knees. After about a year of dating, Noah proposed. They became engaged that spring, and the wedding was set for 3 months later. Rosie refused to move in with him before marriage. As time went on, she noticed a few more red punctures appeared on her skin, and this time she decided to see a doctor. The doctor examined the marks and said, they look like tiny tooth points, sharp and fine, almost like a small incisor. Does it itch? He asked. No. Well, have you gone swimming recently? I don't know how to swim, she said, trying to smile. He advised her to clean the house thoroughly, including the bed, the sofa, and the chairs, just in case insects were the cause. He gave her an antihistamine prescription and an ointment. When she mentioned about the marks to Noah, he told her to move in with him. She hesitated. Later, she agreed. Why go back to the difficulties she had always known? Why return to the struggle when luxury was finally within reach? It was one of the few times in her life when she believed she was making the smart choice. The condition was simple. No more dance classes. No more dance school. He did not want that life for her anymore. She would stay with her mother until the wedding, and after that, she would be his wife. Rosie sold her home and studio. Her mother was delighted. There was so much to prepare for, and 3 months was not long at all. Noah paid for everything, so they splurged. They chose an old chapel for the wedding venue, the finest bridal dress, the best accessories, the caterers from his hotel, and a banquet hall for the reception. It was a grand wedding. Everything went as planned. Their home was the penthouse at Noah's hotel, the same place where they had first met. When he carried Rosie inside after the wedding, she was still floating in the happiness of it all. But once they were inside, he dropped her to the floor. Now get up and change out of that costume, he said sharply. For a moment, Rosie did not understand. The harshness in his voice arrived so suddenly that it felt like a different man was standing before her. Noah, please, she said, already frightened. Do as I say. She changed in the washroom, replacing her bridal wear with a robe. And when she came out, he was waiting for her with a cold, menacing expression. He held her face and told her that she would listen to him. Rosie did not know what had changed. She only knew that the man she had married felt nothing like the man she had fallen for. She lay on the bed and slept in fear. From then on, life with Noah became a nightmare. Every night, she felt him hovering over her in the dark. A strange, damp smell filled their beautiful room. The marks on her neck kept returning, one side or the other, as though some hidden wound was being reopened again and again. Rosie grew weak. She felt tired all the time, as if her strength were being drawn out of her without permission. Some mornings, Noah arranged for one of the female staff members to accompany her to the salon, shopping at certain boutiques, or to just sit alone in a cafe. She tried speaking to them, but they answered with cold, empty looks. Their silence made the city feel smaller. This was not the life she had dreamed of. Yet from the outside, everything looked perfect. She was beautifully dressed. She was cared for. She was married to a rich, handsome man. To everyone else, she was just lucky. Only Rosie knew she lived with a monster. Then she became pregnant. That frightened her more than anything else. I don't want this child, she cried to herself in private. Noah arranged for his own doctor to attend to her, and there was a point at which Rosie finally understood that she had to escape. She planned carefully. One day, she told Noah she was going shopping for baby things. She carried her cell phone and only cash. The woman assigned to watch her was resting, reading a magazine casually, not paying enough attention. Rosie took her chance. She slipped out through the back door, hailed a cab, and raced out of the city to the railway station. She found a train heading to her grandparents' place, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a weight lift from her shoulder. When her grandparents opened the door and saw her, disbelief and relief passed over their faces at the same time. Honey, what's wrong? They asked. Are you here alone? You look exhausted. Where's Noah? And when are you due? Rosie was not responding to any of their questions. I'm leaving Noah, she said. That's all. Her grandparents, wise enough not to ask too many questions too quickly, took her in immediately. Don't let anyone know I'm here, she said. I want to have my baby here. Then we will do everything as you wish, they told her. After a nourishing lunch, she slept. That evening, her grandparents called the family lawyer. Back in the city, the search for Rosie grew frantic. The staff member who had allowed her to slip away was questioned repeatedly by the police. Her mother was contacted. So were her grandparents, though they genuinely knew nothing at first. Every trail seemed to end in confusion. The police were not especially helpful. To them, Rosie was a woman who had apparently landed a rich husband and should have been grateful for it. They treated her disappearance with a kind of casual dismissal that only made things worse. Rosie's lawyer was on her side. He asked Rosie to have her wounds certified and photographed. Then he began divorce proceedings. It took time, but weeks later, Rosie gave birth to a beautiful baby girl called Emily. Not long after that, Noah was served with divorce papers. A case of domestic violence, supported by evidence, was filed against him. He was denied any rights to the baby's life. A female judge, unwilling to tolerate his excuses, ordered him to pay a huge sum in alimony for his misconduct. At last, Rosie was free. She bought a home near her mother's place and built a new dance studio inside it. Much better than the first one. She began again. For a while, life was quiet. Then one dark night, Rosie woke to a faint sound from Emily's room. It was so slight at first that she might have mistaken it for the shifting of air or for the house settling in the heat. But then she heard it again, followed by a small whimper. She was out of bed before fully waking. When she reached the nursery, she stopped so suddenly that the breath caught in her throat. Someone was standing over the crib. At first, she could not understand what she was seeing. The figure was bent in a way that made it seem older than any living person should have been. Its shoulders drawn forward, its body thin and shriveled, as if the years had pressed in all at once. Then slowly, the shape turned its face towards her. It was Noah, or what was left of the man she had married. The familiar beauty was gone. In its place was something hollowed out and dry, with sunken eyes and a stillness that did not belong to the living. He lifted the baby from the crib with a care that was almost tender. Rosie could not move. She could only stand there, frozen in the doorway, while the room seemed to narrow around the sound of her own breathing. Then Noah bent his head to Emily's neck. The moment was so quiet at first that it seemed unreal, as if her mind had refused to admit what her eyes were saying. But the silence did not last. It broke in a small, wet sound that made Rosie's stomach turn cold. Noah did not look up immediately. He held the child close, feeding with an intimacy that was somehow worse than violence. Then slowly, his eyes rose up and found Rosie in the darkness. There was no panic in them, no shame, only recognition. As though this was not a secret at all, but the end of a long arrangement she had only just begun to understand. He finally released the baby. He did not throw her down or flee in a rush. He simply stepped back into the shadow, his mouth stained, his face already beginning to lose the shape she knew. Then he was gone, vanishing like smoke. Rosie fell to the floor. She crawled to the crib on shaking hands, lifted Emily into her arms, and rocked her until the crying stopped. There was a small puncture mark on the baby's neck, neat and unmistakable. It was only then that the truth finally settled over her, heavy and final. Noah had never been a normal man. What lived inside him was older than the marriage, older than the city, older than anything Rosie had let herself imagine. It fed on blood, yes, but not only blood. It fed on trust, on longing, on the foolish hope that love could keep a monster human. Rosie survived, But survival was not the same as escape. She would carry that night with her for the rest of her life, not only because she had almost lost her child, but because she had opened her heart to the one thing that had come to drink from it. And that, in the end, was the cruelest part. She had not only loved a monster, but she had welcomed him in.